I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker. So the movie rests in the visuals, and it's very hard to predict exactly how that's going to play until you've actually cut it together. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly. And I take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's a style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. Visuals are music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing. This whole series of films is based on a 30s genre, on a serial. The acting style is very much from the 30s. Conceptually, it's using the influence and the inspiration of the 30s films as its basis, and the most central of which, obviously, is the Saturday matinee serial.
Alright, so I know I said this was going to be the final part of the series, but as it so happened, the more I worked, the more the project grew and grew and grew, so I had to draw the line somewhere because eventually this is all going to be one video, but releasing it in sections allows for me to keep the videos distinguished by one main topic at a time. And had I continued, that likely wouldn't have been the case. Fun fact, I've actually had most of this video edited together for over a year now, and I only recently made the decision to release it on its own after I made some little additions here and there, as well as some extra polish. So welcome back to the legacy of George Lucas. This is the official part 4 of the series, and for those of you who are just starting this series with part 4, you may be wondering what it's about. Well, to put it simply, if you are any at all familiar with George Lucas and with Star Wars, you'd know there have been copious amounts of lies, pun very much intended, levied against the legendary filmmaker about how the Star Wars saga was actually made. These lies mainly come from bottom-of-the-barrel media outlets, as well as disgruntled fans or fanboys that didn't like the direction that Star Wars went in post-1983, or hell, even before that. And they would then grow up, well, physically at least, to work for the same bottom-of-the-barrel media outlets, or hell, they became influencers with crappy-ass media blogs and video channels of their own, propagating the same tired, inaccurate bullshit with a very clear, malicious agenda to take away from George Lucas's incredible legacy, be it for their own financial gain or their own sense of personal satisfaction. Now, part 1 of this series discusses at length the misinformation and/or lies invented by the fans and the media alike pertaining to George Lucas as a filmmaker, how he directs, writes, and edits together his films, oblivious to the fact that he, like any other filmmaker, has his own style that he consistently applied to every single one of the Star Wars films, including the prequel trilogy and not just the original 3 from their childhood, which they incessantly cling to. Part 2 deals with the misinformation and or lies that the media and certain fans propagate en masse that are hell-bent on the revisionist history of Star Wars and trying to reallocate most, if not all, of the meaningful contributions made to the Star Wars original trilogy by George Lucas to his collaborators, also known as the Help, who had to quote-unquote save the movies from him, as well as the less than flattering accounts from certain cast and crew on his directing and writing, which are very much inaccurate or simply untrue. Part 3 discusses at length the prequel trilogy and clears up a lot of the false notions of straight up bullshit, really, surrounding George Lucas as a collaborator that many have clung to as the fairy tale reason for why the prequels supposedly quote-unquote ruined their precious childhood.
George Lucas raped our childhood.
Including but not limited to only having competent collaborators on the original trilogy, or hell, the baseless speculation that he only collaborated at all on the original trilogy, and not the prequel trilogy.
Stop!
Which couldn't be further from the truth, and to his credit, much like his filmmaking style, George Lucas kept the same collaboration style he used on the original trilogy for the prequels as well. As mentioned at the end of Part 3, the purpose of Part 4 is to shed a very nuanced spotlight on much of the media and fan agenda surrounding the backlash, or rather the lack of backlash, if we're being honest, surrounding the prequel trilogy at its time of release, which mostly consisted of a very loud minority online, which was signal boosted by the mainstream, which, considering all things, mainly had to do with a very unjust hatred for 2 of the actors that took part in the films, and which the narrative then mutated over the course of years into revisionism about the hatred being far more widespread, which was aimed to gaslight later generations into thinking the movies, and more specifically its actors, were always reviled by the largest majority, and how George Lucas apparently ruined their lives because his prequel films were just apparently so horrible. Which, I mean, couldn't have been a more disingenuous spin on history when you consider the source of where this backlash came from, as you'll soon see. And of course, in the years since, this would all result in the blatant hypocrisy in terms of what was considered fair game when it came to the Disney films, once Star Wars was quote-unquote saved from George Lucas, as many of these same prequel detractors from both the fanbase and the media alike were so gleefully putting it at the time. Now, throughout this video, I do make plenty of references to parts 1, 2, and 3 that I don't really take the time to elaborate on, in the interest of not repeating myself or retreading old ground, which is why I say it's probably best you start with part 1 and watch the series in chronological order, much like Star Wars itself, in fact, so it would make the most sense.
You gotta remember, this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So, I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
So if you're watching this out of order and are confused about what exactly I'm referencing, you'll just have to take my word for it. And if you're interested, check out the other parts when you're done. Anyway, now that you have a fairly clear idea of what you're in for, let's begin. Now, as we've covered long and loud in this video, the media is an incredibly fickle beast that constantly flip-flops the narrative to whatever serves them best. But then again, so are some of the most ardent detractors of George Lucas, and by proxy the Star Wars prequels, and given that many of these same fanatical weirdos grew up to be lead writers for many of these same shitty-ass media outlets, and often use their employment to throw shade at George Lucas whenever they can, well, these 2 demographics of Star Wars degenerates and scumbag media journalists can often overlap with one another. So do keep that in mind before I debunk this next piece of Star Wars media and fandom horseshit. Though granted, before I do, I want to reiterate that I know that most Star Wars fans are normal, civilized people who possess a healthy comprehension, intelligence, passion, and insight, and have far more than just a modicum of taste. Meaning, they don't belong to this insufferable, bottom-feeding, parasitic demographic who seemingly possess none of those things.
George Lucas raped our childhood.
So uncivilized.
And the only passion they possess is one that serves their own petulant needs.
That's not part of my Star Wars.
Hence why, again, I've mostly just used clips from that absolute joke of a documentary to act as a stand-in for that collective of vermin, which started all this nonsense.
Don't start what you can't finish!
Not only did these individuals do their best to run George Lucas and the prequels into the ground, and failed, as is clearly evident today, but also anyone else who contributed to quote-unquote ruining their childhood, which resulted in a lot of hostile attention from both the media and fans, directed at most particularly the actors who played these three characters, those being Ahmed Best's Jar Binks, Jake Lloyd's child Anakin Skywalker, and Hayden Christensen's teenage Anakin Skywalker. And as a result, narratives from both the media and fans, and in many cases, the two collectives overlapping, were spun about these cast members in order to raise a middle finger at both George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels. Now, I did briefly get into Hayden Christensen's troubles, and how both the media and the fans have done somewhat of a 180 on the guy, while still trying to cast blame at George Lucas, even though George Lucas had a hand in everything that they seem to praise about Hayden Christensen. Because again, these clowns love to flip-flop their stupid fairy tale fucking narrative to whatever serves them best. Meaning it's okay to praise Hayden Christensen now, but George Lucas still needs to be dragged through the mud. Look, we already got into that, I'm not going to reiterate it here. So what do you say we move on to Ahmed Best? Now, many people in 2024 at least agree that the backlash that Ahmed Best received was undeserved, and side note, but the narrative has swayed solely to blaming the media for the actor's mental health issues because the actor mentioned in a Twitter post from 2018 that he actually did contemplate suicide due to the vocal media backlash towards his character from the Phantom Menace. The media then took the ball and ran with this, saying that toxic fans nearly caused the actor to end his life. And one of the big reasons the media decided to do this, and why they had very little interest in telling Ahmed Best's side of the story prior to 2018, and also one of the reasons for why this story was so wide-reaching, is because this post from Ahmed Best came to light in the aftermath of the backlash towards the, at the time, most despised Disney Star Wars movie, that being The Last Jedi, and most particularly the backlash that actress Kelly Marie Tran was receiving at the time for her character, which was almost certainly the most despised aspect of that movie. Now, the media, who especially back then was notorious for taking up arms to defend their Disney Star Wars purchase, after decades of writing slimy-ass, deceitful articles about George Lucas and doing their damnedest to drag his legacy through the mud, was now spending months on the offensive against Star Wars fans who suddenly hated the horse that the media was backing. All of a sudden, Kelly Marie Tran was victim number one from what the media labeled as toxic Star Wars fans after she closed her Instagram account to avoid harassment, and as a result, also chose to shine a limelight on Ahmed Best's tragic story, which they previously had little to no interest in until it best suited their agenda. More than just a bit hypocritical, and with more than just a little bit of weapons-grade projection on their behalf, considering they spent much of the late 90s and early 2000s actively contributing to and enabling the same fucking thing. And hell, just as one example of the media dogpiling on and fanning the hate flames for Jar Binks, and look, I know this is an April Fool's joke, though a really pathetic and tasteless one, but nonetheless, the media, who at this point was made up of an even larger proportion of the same butthurt chucklefucks that threw a hissy fit about Jar back in 1999, and who are now actively protecting Kelly Marie Tran at all costs, as well as trying to backpedal and deflect their treatment of Jar Binks and Ahmed Best onto quote-unquote toxic fans. But well, here the media are in 2011, and they were more than happy to shine a positive light on a bunch of Star Wars freaks simulating a subway mugging of the character they hated. Now, joke or no joke, replace Jar Binks with Rose Tico and then tell me that the backlash between the characters was exactly the same. Though granted, social media and the internet has become a much stronger presence now than all the way back when The Phantom Menace released. But that didn't stop butthurt individuals in the entertainment industry from scratching their little Jar Jar must die itch very publicly. And hell, some freaks even had fucking websites solely dedicated to shitting on that particular character. Hell, some of those websites were even coming out before The Phantom Menace even released, because these same degenerates just didn't like how the character looked or sounded just from the trailers. Like, talk about poisoning the well. Case in point would be notorious prequel hater and two-faced Hollywood cockroach,
I hate the prequels.
none other than Mr. Simon Pegg, who I mentioned previously and will inevitably come back to later. But Pegg, who gained a lot of clout and attention by openly trashing the Star Wars prequels on television and elsewhere for years in the most unapologetically and obnoxiously crass way possible that a person in his unique position arguably could have. Like, seriously, watch or read some of his interviews in the lead up to The Force Awakens, a film he himself, as an original trilogy fanboy, was brought on as a consultant for and had a personal hand in, by the way, and you'll wonder how this smug prick didn't have the lights punched out of him. Seriously, the guy was absolutely shameless. But the answer as to why this was so casually accepted and likely encouraged, not only by the people he answered to in the industry who paid his fucking salary, but also the media and certain fans alike, is because, again, the Disney trilogy was quote-unquote saving Star Wars from George Lucas, Yippee, and Jar Jar Binks. However, fast forward to the post-Last Jedi Backlash, which then bled into The Force Awakens as well, which again was a dumpster fire that Pegg himself had a personal hand in shaping, and you'll notice a drastic shift in his tone from being a smug, fanboy, George Lucas bashing prick
I've had a few things to work through, you know.
With Sarah.
No, with George Lucas.
to all of a sudden denouncing the quote-unquote toxic Star Wars fandom that he not only endorsed, but actively led the fucking charge himself for. But all of a sudden, because of the backlash Kelly Marie Tran and the Disney films were receiving, suddenly Pegg flip-flopped and condemned the very fans who are giving this garbage Star Wars fan fiction trilogy the same treatment, the trilogy, mind you, that these scumbag media publications and People vs. George Lucas fanboy pricks, meaning by proxy Simon Pegg himself. All of a sudden, this behavior was now frowned upon, and only then did Simon Pegg express some faux regret for how he acted in the past that had a direct impact on Ahmed Best's life and acting career, because none of these assholes gave a single solitary shit before, and let's be frank here, they still don't, but they'll sure as shit fake it on camera.
I feel so ashamed of the fact that there was actually a victim, a human victim in that. I think most people were regarding Jar Jar Binks like he was a real creature and wailing on him for being annoying or whatever, or not liking him. But there was a person behind that. And that I read that and just thought, Christ, you know, I'm one of those people. It makes me feel awful.
As someone who kind of was, you know, kicked off about the prequels in when they came out, the Star Wars fan base really seems to be the most kind of toxic at the moment. I'm probably being very controversial to say that. I mean, I'm out of it now. I've apologized for the things I said about, you know, Jar Jar Binks, because of course there was a fucking actor involved there, and he was getting a lot of flack, and it wasn't a camp rabbit, it was a human being,
right?
And because it got a lot of hate, he suffered, you know, and I feel terrible about being part of that.
Really makes you think.
The biggest difference between the backlash received by Ahmed Best and the backlash received by Kelly Marie Tran is that one was completely endorsed, encouraged, and enabled by the media, and the other wasn't. So go fuck yourselves, you lying sacks of shit. Oh, and by the way, just a side note here, but apparently one of those articles written about the problematic nature of Jar Jar's character back in 1999, again, more weapons-grade projection from the media, and not to mention the current year hypocrisy, that nowadays those same media outlets can't seem to shut up about including forced, tokenized, diversity, nothing burger characters that represent minorities into film just to fill a fucking quota. But regardless, this particular article contains excerpts from the same toilet salad bottom feeder who made the the Jar Jar Must Die website before The Phantom Menace even released, who after running through some of Jar Jar's quotes from the trailers, as well as written on some of the toys, is quoted in the article saying, "How can you like a character like that? It's a great movie, but Jar Jar really detracted from the movie as a whole." Now, while some might agree with that general sentiment, and I certainly don't, because it takes more than a goofy-inspired alien rabbit speaking in a weird English dialect who's occasionally used for some slapstick comedy to detract from my movie experience.
Because I got parents. That's why. Because I was raised.
That being said, like, bitching about a cartoon rabbit because of a couple of lines he gives in his weird alien English dialect, which, just to point out here, is the only rationale this degenerate provides for his actions, is hardly any reason to cry a fit online with your very own website dedicated to trashing the character.
Take it down a notch.
But hold up, rewind for just a second. What's that? The Phantom Menace was a great movie, apparently? Seriously? But wasn't The Phantom Menace a terrible movie?
No!
Didn't everyone hate the film when it came out, like the media and the pitiful versus George Lucas would have you believe?
No!
But wasn't Jar Jar Binks the worst character in the history of time and completely destroyed The Phantom Menace? And fundamentally broke every aspect of it?
No!
See, I'd wager that back in 1999, this excerpt was considered something of a hot take, since most people, in fact, loved the film when it came out, despite what the media and the modern-day online climate would have you believe, and the fact that back then the internet was still relatively primitive at that time, meaning this vocal minority of degenerates had a very limited means of voicing their pathetic, petulant fucking outrage. But good lord, I can't help but giggle and laugh at the irony that, of all people, the guy who started the Jar Jar Must Die website before The Phantom Menace even released also has one of the more tame responses towards the character when you consider the revisionist history bullshit and snowball effect towards the character online in the years following, where both the media and this fan collective of douchebags tried to make out that The Phantom Menace was the most hated movie of all time, with the extent of their rationale, for the most part, amounting to none other than Jar Jar Binks.
10 loved it, 7 liked it or thought it was okay, and 2 are no longer Star Wars fans.
Like that long-eared alien dude, I mean, he always messed up, but he ended up helping his army and stuff. I thought it was pretty good.
However, what was quite enlightening to read is another article that was published not weeks before The Phantom Menace released, foreshadowing, but rather a far more nuanced piece of journalism.
I know, right?
That was actually quite neutral on the matter of Jar Jar Binks, and far more honest on the subject, since it was published before it became a popular media frenzy to see who could appease the greater number of degenerate fanboys with the most scathing hit piece imaginable. Meaning this article provides a far more accurate understanding of the climate surrounding the character than the far more modern media publications of the current day stroking their little fiction in hindsight. Anyway, this article was published in June 1999 by the Rolling Stones, and largely consists of a lengthy interview with Ahmed himself, and also interviews from other cast and crew members as well. It openly talks about Jar Jar Binks as a well-received character by the bulk of audience members, with the exception of, you guessed it, a loudmouth minority on the internet, where the character was evidently far more polarizing, and of course, this was before that same internet collective began to revise history en masse and outright bullied the zeitgeist into despising a harmless comic side character that is nothing new to Star Wars, let's not forget.
What have you done? I'm backwards, you sleeping furball.
And also, let's be frank, would have simply been met with an indifferent shoulder shrug by those same degenerates had the character existed in any other franchise that wasn't the sole reason that gave their miserable lives meaning.
Got a problem, buddy? Huh? Huh? Do you? Want a piece of me? Hey, Mr. Grumpy Gills. What's
Dory.
going on? Come on, you gotta try this!
Will you just stop it?
Going backwards, turn us around! Give me the wheels! Give me the wheels!
Only when it was funny.
Or, for example, if another franchise had a character that filled the exact same comic sidekick role as Jar Jar Binks, minus his character arc and the quote-unquote Jamaican accent, which I'll have plenty to say about shortly, although this character in question was meant for a slightly older target audience that nonetheless had no trouble making the comparison. Oh, and he just so happens to be from another classic movie that came out the same year as The Phantom Menace did.
No way! He just set this man on fire! Oh my god! He's Bro's the British Jar Jar Binks!
He is! Come on! Let's go, Jar Jar! Americans.
Yeah, nah, trust, we feel the same way about ourselves.
For the record,
where'd it go?
If I don't make it out of here,
it's behind his
don't put me down
eyes.
for mummification.
Likewise.
This guy is totally like Jar Jar in Star Wars. He constantly fucks things up, but he does it in a fashion that advances the plot and actually helps them out. So his stupidity is key.
Meanwhile,
Dump your guts in this stuff.
Holy shit!
Told you, Jar Jar Binks.
Dude, he really is. It's kind of crazy.
Your support is well seen.
The article goes on to detail a few heartwarming stories from behind the scenes on episode 1, told by Ahmed Best, one of which is how George Lucas took Natalie Portman and Ahmed Best backstage at a Michael Jackson concert, and George Lucas introduced Ahmed as Jar Jar Binks because Michael Jackson was originally clamoring to play the character.
Wow! What do you know?
The article goes on to say that Liam Neeson, who really admired Ahmed as a person, also really admired Ahmed's talent and tried to get him signed by several agents who he had worked with in the past. But because the fanboy media was so obnoxiously loud and amplified by the mainstream, we all know why that sadly didn't pan out. But here's the thing, like, even if certain people still can't get over Jar Jar as a character, over 25 years later, actors are meant to act. It is their job to act, to pretend, because they are not actually the character. And Ahmed Best, based solely on how convincing he was as the character due to his transformative talent to become the character, he is indisputably a damn fine actor. And this anti-Jar Jar movement, cooked up by these Generation X baby boomer Star Wars ultra dweebs, who thought Best committed a crime against their precious childhood, brought any and all aspirations that he had as an actor to a grinding halt. All that said, probably the most important piece of insight the article gives that flies right in the face of the broader fanboy media narrative that was being pushed is Ahmed Best's response to the claims that Jar Jar Binks was a racist caricature and that George Lucas and the Phantom Menace were pushing a derogatory racial agenda. And to the surprise of what should be absolutely no one, here is what Ahmed Best had to say. The Rolling Stones article discusses the polarizing reception that Jar Jar has had amongst a very loud minority both on the internet and in the media, and much like the other accounts George Lucas gave that we've discussed, the article states that Lucas doesn't care too terribly that some folks have a problem with Jar Jar. It then quotes Lucas, "I think the comic relief character is an important dramatic device," he says. "Some of the fans that want the Phantom Menace to be the Terminator don't like the idea that there are comic characters in it. I certainly am not going to make a grim bloodfest out of Star Wars," end quote. The article then goes on to detail Ahmed Best's thoughts on the matter concerning certain media allegations against the character. As the cult of Jar Jar grows, so too does the rumor mill, a hazard of celebrity. There are the whispers that Jar Jar is gay. It then quotes Ahmed Best saying, "Where the hell did they get that from?" whilst quaffing bottled water at a favourite Brooklyn coffee shop. Best was recently quizzed about Jar Jar's proclivities by reporters at the Phantom Menace press junket. Quote, "They wanted a scoop," he shrugs. "I guess they wanted to get the gay amphibian community in on the movie," end quote. The article then goes on to say, don't even get Ahmed Best started on the current theory that Jar Jar is Jamaican. It then quotes Ahmed Best saying, "That is a really big insult to Jamaican people," he declares. "Just because the language is a bit different, they stick an accent on it? Jar Jar has nothing to do with the Caribbean. He is an amphibian from the planet Naboo. End quote. One reporter was concerned that Jar Jar, being of Caribbean descent, was perpetuating the slave mentality by being indebted to Qui-Gon Jinn. It then quotes Ahmed best. I said, you know what? You've got to check your head and examine your own beliefs. Jar Jar is an orange frog. Heads need to relax. That shit is crazy. He takes a pause. I just thought I was doing a funny role, he says. I didn't know that the Jedi were a metaphor for the man. End quote.
The movie is pretty neutral. It is in outer space. These are aliens. How in the world you could take an orange amphibian and say that he's a Jamaican? I mean, even the idea of taking his ears and calling them dreadlocks is kind of a strange stretch as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's completely absurd. And what that came out of ultimately was there is a group of fans from the films that don't like comic sidekicks. They want the films to be tough and like Terminator, and they want to be, real guy movies. And they get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike, which the movies are for children, but they don't want to admit that, or a comic sidekick, because they don't want comedy in these movies. And in the first film, they absolutely hated R2 and 3PO. Now Jar Jar is getting accused of the same thing.
Gee, I can't imagine why that never gets brought up when certain scumbag media outlets and or George Lucas detractors drudge up Jar Jar Binks or any of the oddly sounding prequel characters like a broken record to play the race card as weak source in lieu of any actual substantive criticism, which, as I've said, should tell you just how little they have to work with in the first place. But boy, do they love their straw grasping. However, back to my point about the media trying to conflate the backlash that Kelly Marie Tran received with that of Ahmed Best's, and trying to deflect and point blame at quote-unquote toxic fans for Kelly Marie Tran leaving social media. However, the response from many fans to this news about Kelly Marie Tran leaving Instagram was taking aim at the media themselves, since in the actress's statement, her reasoning only included the media harassing her and not the fans. And not to mention, in later interviews and statements by Kelly Marie Tran, she elaborates on her decision to leave social media by saying it had more to do with the Hollywood atmosphere as well as racial marginalization and unwanted media attention. She never makes direct reference to any fandom toxicity, although I'd imagine some of which is at the very least implied, and the only direct reference to her leaving social media due to nasty people come from secondhand sources who have associated with her. But the media, of course, just took this ball and ran with it hard to deflect blame and framing the decision of Kelly Marie Tran to leave social media being solely attributed to the worst of the Star Wars fanbase. I'm not saying Kelly Marie Tran didn't get harassed by a collective of asshole Star Wars fans. It would be straight up disingenuous and delusional to say that they didn't exist. And again, you can thank the People versus George Lucas and the online prequel piñata party that the internet held for damn near a decade for giving the media all the ammunition that they would ever need to label Star Wars fans as the problem. Because, as you guys no doubt well know, most Star Wars fans aren't like that. Yeah, I hate the Disney movies because they took a ginormous dump on both George Lucas and Star Wars as a whole, but I never took my anger out on anything but the movies. And for far more legitimate reasons than anything these clowns fucking concocted, the sum of which amounted to a cartoon rabbit with long ears and a 9-year-old character gleefully yelling yippee, weak fucking sauce. Yeah, absolutely scathing stuff there. And I know many of you out there share the same sentiment, but guess what? Too bad! Because now you as a collective are lumped in with these assholes according to the media. But again, the media, in their infinite hypocrisy, as well as the collective that they once endorsed, have now turned this into a blame game, and due to the nature of the statement from both Rose Tico's actress, as well as Ahmed Best's now infamous tweet, those same fanatical, degenerate Jar Jar detractors, as well as influencers too, have since opted to shift the narrative of who contributed to causing Ahmed Best to contemplate suicide solely on the media and away from themselves. But of course, neither side backpedaling their blame away from George Lucas, who created Jar Jar, because, again, while Ahmed Best was a by-proxy victim of this, the main target for the backlash was George Lucas, and it was designed to always come back to him. Because Jar Jar still exists, and he's the one that they need to blame for ruining their childhood. So despite the narrative shifting around Ahmed Best, they'll always maintain that they were justified in blaming George, even though, again, as I mentioned earlier, much of what they hated about Jar Jar came from Ahmed Best himself, as per George's directorial and collaborative style that they insist didn't exist, in order to maintain their own little narratives about him being a control freak on the prequels and always shifting the goalpost wherever necessary to suit their agenda. George must be blamed when it's something they don't like, and George must be ignored when it's something that they do. But returning to the backlash directed solely at Ahmed Best and this new spin on the narrative that this particular demographic of Star Wars freaks and influencers have chosen to indulge, with solely blaming the media for Ahmed Best's mental health problems, pretending as if they didn't act like total, insufferable, embarrassing fucking jerks. Make no mistake, this idea that the media is solely to blame is equally, if not more so, a blatant fucking lie on their behalf as well. And not only that, but it actually works against this bogus campaign of theirs against Jar Jar's character and the narrative that he was maligned by the bulk of Star Wars fans when the prequels first came out. Back to that momentarily, but firstly, remember when I said the media only gave Ahmed Best's story mass attention after The Last Jedi backlash? Well, so did this same collective of Star Wars freaks, again including but not limited to influencers as well, who most of which didn't give a rat's ass about Ahmed Best's story and or his mental health issues until it became something that suited their agenda, be it against the media or in the media's case, against the fans. See, neither the media or the fans, at least for the most part, were very interested in telling Ahmed Best's story prior to The Last Jedi backlash, and for the most part, even still. But both collectives, most particularly in this case from the fans, in this instance, since it's more damning towards them in this case and undercuts this whole quote-unquote it was the media's fault crap that they've lately started spinning, because prior to The Last Jedi backlash, just a year prior in fact, in 2017, Ahmed Best gave an interview to Wired magazine. Oh joy, we get to talk about those clowns again. Yahoo! But actually, in this instance, to their credit, they allowed Ahmed Best to tell his story in far more depth than that 250 character tweet of his that the media and especially fans have decided to cook another narrative out of. But in the interview, Best details how he was very much a part of the Star Wars online conversation. Again, we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s, when online fan culture was very primitive, and where mostly the hardcore fanatical Star Wars fans resided, and thus he was exposed to much of the extreme backlash that was levied towards his character, that most Star Wars fans and most of the general public were not privy to, and did not engage in. And he even had fans both online and in the real world come up to him and say horrific shit, including but not limited to death threats in some cases. Which again, given the People vs. George Lucas and the fact that many of these insane people took part in a website dedicated to trashing Jar Jar and poisoning the well prior to The Phantom Menace being released, before they even saw the movie, and this taking place in a time that was long before playing the quote-unquote death threats card became a trend in pop culture and online to deflect backlash with a sympathy shield, I think we're all inclined to believe Ahmed Best's words in this interview. And this certainly, again, undercuts the whole solely blaming the media agenda that a certain demographic of Star Wars fans and influencers have started running with. Now look, I have no love for the media, as I've outlined extensively in this video, and am about to take it one step further with the next topic, but this ridiculous demographic of Star Wars degenerates is equally to blame, if not more so, and both sides are so pathetic and childish. Instead of recognizing what is, they've instead resorted to playing this ridiculous, childish, bullshit fucking blame game instead of taking responsibility not just for what happened to Ahmed Best, but what they each embarrassingly contributed to the grand domino effect which led Star Wars into the miserable state it's in today. Secondly, regarding the backlash levied at Ahmed Best, in that very same George Lucas interview with Empire magazine back in 1999 that people like to cherry pick with the slimy agenda of trying to discredit the man, when questioned about the extremely loud fan backlash levied against Jar Binks, though I'm only paraphrasing here, George Lucas makes it crystal clear that it was simply a vocal minority online of disgruntled 30 or 40-something-year-olds crying a bitch fit, reeing into the void, which are simply singular individuals expressing an opinion and not the vast majority, which we should all be inclined to agree with since the prequels predate social media. But the reason these losers were getting any kind of mainstream attention was due to the shitty-ass media outlets with their own agenda giving those parasites a much louder voice. Ergo to those scumbags out there trying to deflect their embarrassing, middle-aged, petulant fucking outrage onto the media, you cannot solely blame the media for the backlash the actors received without also pointing the finger at yourselves. But nice try, I guess. That being said, there's also the matter of Star Wars actor Jake Lloyd, who also suffered from mental health issues after The Phantom Menace released, and who has also had a ton of lies spun about him over the years from both fans and especially the online sphere of shitty-ass media outlets. Now, both the media and fans, at least up until recently, have tried to conflate Jake Lloyd's experience with that of Ahmed Best's. And although both of their experiences do share some similarities with each other, they are also, however, quite different. And in the case of Jake Lloyd, it's actually quite appalling just how much this collective of Star Wars fan media and detractors against the prequels have exploited Jake's troubles after The Phantom Menace into something they could weaponize against George Lucas and the Star Wars films that they didn't like. See, the common narrative surrounding Jake Lloyd is that he was traumatized from the aftermath of negativity that The Phantom Menace received, which in large part was directed at both him and his character. So much so, in fact, that he had such a miserable life afterwards that he developed paranoid schizophrenia and had a complete psychotic breakdown as a result of how apparently hated The Phantom Menace was.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Now, in the past, this was often framed as sympathy for Jake Lloyd, but as a derogatory comment against the film and George Lucas because, oh my god, the movie was supposedly so bad it ruined someone's life. Ah yes, even more weak source to fuel this petulant agenda of theirs. However, would it surprise anyone at this point in the video to find out that in actuality this is mostly based on a lie?
No!
Now, I'm not going to use the word revealed because in actuality what I'm about to tell you was revealed many years ago, in fact. I'll get back to that. But what grabbed mass media attention in 2024 and dispelled much of the anti-Lucas, anti-prequel narrative surrounding Jake Lloyd was a recent interview with Jake Lloyd's own mother, who explicitly says, to paraphrase here, that this notion of Jake Lloyd hating Star Wars is absolutely not true and never was. His condition schizophrenia was likely hereditary from his father's side of the family, and that he's had a lot to deal with in his personal life, including but not limited to the tragic loss of his sister, which all likely contributed to his mental breakdown. And contrary to popular belief, Lloyd's mother insisted that most, if not all, of the backlash that came out of the Star Wars fandom when The Phantom Menace released was done so online, and so Jake was minimally exposed to it because she kept him off the internet. Now, just a couple of things here. Firstly, while there shouldn't be any doubt that Lloyd's mother is being truthful about her son's mental condition, and understand this is nothing against Lloyd's acting, he did a fine job with his role. But personally, if there was any suspicion of schizophrenia being a possible hereditary condition that might develop in his later years, then allowing Jake to act in the first place, and in the most popular and freakishly media-covered movie franchise of all time, might not have directly caused his illness. But I think it goes without saying that it absolutely didn't do his mental health any favors by being in such a spotlight from such a young age. And in hindsight, from my own personal opinion anyway, the decision to allow him to do this seems incredibly misguided. But again, that's not really anything to do with The Phantom Menace or the media and fan backlash to Lloyd's character, What does have to do with it is the fact that Jake's mother is insisting that he was minimally exposed to the backlash because most of it was online. Ergo, the bulk of people who saw the film did not hate Jake Lloyd's portrayal of Anakin Skywalker from The Phantom Menace, as most of them belonged to the online cesspool back then, before the internet was completely ubiquitous. And as a matter of fact, the comments from Jake Lloyd's mother also falls perfectly in line with what Lucas said back in 1999 in regards to the backlash towards Jar Binks, that those parasites online is just one person at a time blogging out their shallow opinion, and that vocal minority was simply signal boosted by the mainstream media, whereas the overall data, and hell, the toy sales even, told a much different story. In actuality, the bulk of, shall we say, normal audience members that saw the film reacted positively, even praising young Jake Lloyd for his acting chops.
I think that little Anakin Skywalker, and everyone's going to say it, stole that movie.
I mean, after all, he was portraying an intellectually gifted, albeit somewhat immature and slightly goofy, innocent child with a healthy degree of optimism despite his bleak upbringing, and Jake Lloyd did exactly that. Jake even went on to receive praise from none other than the likes of Mark Hamill himself, and hell, even Ron Howard, who most of you are no doubt aware of, knows more than just a little bit about coming up in the industry as a child actor. And on that note, returning to the media's influence in enabling the online backlash directed at Jake Lloyd, Ron Howard, this absolute G, famously wrote a very blunt letter to Newsweek in January of 1999 for a shit piece they wrote, not only trashing the Phantom Menace itself, which very similarly to that Jar Jar Must Die website, which was created days before the Phantom Menace even came out, tried to poison the well, in this case months before episode 1 was even released, but more specifically, that shit piece from Newsweek also took shots at Jake Lloyd's acting performance, their only source supposedly being unnamed insiders who were present behind the scenes. And Ron Howard in his letter is having absolutely none of it, which I will now quote. Howard's letter goes as follows. While your Buzz Wars episode 1 piece was generally snide and insipid, the pot shot at 9-year-old Jake Lloyd was downright irresponsible. The piece cites unnamed quote-unquote insiders who are critical of the 9-year-old's performance. I have no way of knowing how accomplished or professional he may have appeared during the principal filming, but I seriously doubt these quote-unquote insiders are inside enough to have seen an edited version of the new Star Wars, because I have. And in my opinion, Jake Lloyd is terrific in the film, which by the way is truly amazing. Movies are subject to public scrutiny, yes, but for Newsweek to attack a child's performance based on rumor and without even having seen the movie is shameful. As someone who was acting professionally at an early age, I can assure you that 9-year-old Jake is quite capable of reading, understanding, and feeling the full humiliation of a piece like that. He may not be able to comprehend the reason that it was printed, but then obviously neither can I. Maybe someone from your editorial staff should try and explain it to him. Sincerely, Ron Howard. Funnily enough, there was very little buzz surrounding this letter that was sent by Ron Howard in defense of Jake Lloyd. However, in 2024, this got mass media attention now that Jake Lloyd is widely seen as a victim. Whereas before, just like Jar Binks for that matter, that wasn't the case. And matter of fact, that greasy piece of journalistic shit who made the original shit piece chose to write about the experience sometime later, working for a new, equally shitty media outlet, saying that after Newsweek received the letter, for a while his articles were somewhat more scrutinized after that by his editor. Yeah, I guess that happens when you manage to piss off Ron Howard, who actually has an educated opinion on the matter.
And action!
Which you provided absolutely no citation for whatsoever to push an agenda based on your own personal reception to the theatrical trailer for a bunch of cheap clicks. And then this slimy rat goes on to admit that at the end of the Phantom Menace screening he attended, there was massive sustained applause.
No shit.
But having already a preconceived and very public bias and having to commit to his bit, decided to double down with what can basically be summed up as A very childish, I was right and everyone else at the time was wrong mentality, the kind you're likely to find on a grade school playground. And then he goes on to say, over time, he was proven right by the sway in public perception, claiming that he was now in the majority.
That's a good one.
Ah yes, when arguments fail, just cling to popular opinion fallacy as a shield. Though I suppose in this case, an imaginary popular opinion fallacy. That's a tactic so commonly utilized, it's gotta be in the anti-prequel butthurt fanboy playbook somewhere. Once again, weak source, ladies and gentlemen. Now granted, this journalist's recount of the experience was written back in 2015, just prior to the release of The Force Awakens, when online vitriol aimed at George Lucas and the prequels was at an all-time high. So maybe he thought that cotton wool would allow him to very delusionally think that he was in the majority and not simply part of an online cesspool, much of which has shifted in the opposite direction in recent years, due to more and more factual accounts regarding George Lucas and the prequels coming into the public eye. And what exactly was this empty-headed dipshit's huge grievances with the Phantom Menace? Aside from being pissy that people loved it when it came out, despite his original shit piece? Well, apparently too much cheesy CGI in a movie that had more practical effects than the entire OT combined, and whatever CGI was in the movie was years, perhaps decades ahead of its time. Hell, modern-day Marvel films have been praised for delivering less by much of the same journalistic trash. Okay, let's see what other huge quote-unquote flaws he found with the film. Oh yes, apparently the Phantom Menace was too quote-unquote sunny. Okay. Fucking what? Has this idiot ever seen Star Wars?
You'll be malfunctioning within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile.
What? Listen to them. They're dying, R2.
Seriously.
Have you even seen Star Wars?
Everything's under control. Situation normal. How are you?
Who is this? What's your operating number?
Boring conversation anyway.
Unless, of course, he's operating under that Empire Strikes Back symptard logic of Star Wars always needing to be dark and adult in order to be specifically tailored to them. But whatever.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
Just open the door, you stupid lump!
I don't know how we're gonna get out of this one.
R2!
Let's see, what else? Quote, George Lucas supposedly being out of touch, end quote, whatever the fuck that means. It's basically just a bunch of hot air because, of course, no example is provided, and The Phantom Menace was one of the highest grossing films ever when it released, and also recently broke records at the box office for a re-release on its 25th anniversary. I don't know by what metric imaginable the film could possibly be considered out of touch. And lastly, the scumbag triples down on supposedly being right about Jake Lloyd and his acting all along, because remember, quote-unquote insiders told him, and the only impression he got was a bunch of split-second snippets from a 2-minute trailer, which, much like his original shit piece, he provides absolutely no citation or example of, though we can bet he'd probably use one of Anakin's goofy childlike lines.
Yippee! Now this is pod racing.
That are perfectly within character, as if to make some kind of point, and if he did, this douchebag has got nerve to talk about anyone else being quote-unquote out of touch.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
And, well, that's it. That's the extent of what this narrow-minded and tasteless journo douchebag has for a rationale. And hell, if you needed any more proof that this journalistic douche is an absolute moron, this prick in his coping article goes on to try and play the racism card directed at the prequels, because that's the level of intellect this parasite possesses.
nothing.
And he clearly knows nothing about the making of The Phantom Menace, because everybody involved with Episode 1, or any of the prequels, including Ahmed Best, has adamantly denied the accusations of racist characters, and called this narrative out for being a load of media-driven bullshit. This scumbag was so far up his own arse, he actually thought he knew better than the likes of Ron Howard on this subject. A former child actor, writer-director, Ron Howard, who had some actual behind-the-scenes input on The Phantom Menace, as we already discussed. But then again, neither Ron Howard or Mark Hamill attached their metric of judgment to how much Jake Lloyd supposedly ruined their precious Darth Vader, like these scumbag degenerates and their revisionist history bullshit like to pretend. Many of whom, which grew up to be that same piece of shit who worked for Newsweek back in 1999, who somehow still has a fucking job shoveling shit for a living online.
Really makes you think.
However, once again, this led to much of the fanbase who was not only enabled by the media, remember, but proud of the backlash the character and the actor received. And just to quickly further add to my point regarding that Newsweek article from 1999, pre-Phantom Menace release that tried to poison the well in regards to both the movie and Jake Lloyd, under the guise of insiders supposedly feeding the outlet information from behind the scenes, this journalist Shitstain goes on to admit in his follow-up article that he was just simply giving credence to and signal boosting what the most extreme negative side of the fanbase was propagating. Gee, so much for those insiders, I guess. Bearing in mind again, this was months before the film was even released. Doesn't that demonstrate beyond any shred of doubt the level that the media stooped to back in the day to push an agenda by enabling the worst of the Star Wars fanbase, as well as the embarrassing level of backlash levied towards both the movies and the actors over such trivial horseshit? And trust me, in regards to Jake Lloyd, this isn't even the lowest they're willing to stoop to. I'll get back to that shortly, but again, many of that same collective of Star Wars freaks likely grew up to become shitty-ass journalists with similar shitty-ass agendas of their own, like this colossal jerk-off. But see, nowadays, since times have changed, and this is no longer something that the mainstream likes to applaud, those same individuals from that shitty-ass collective of fans, if you want to call them that, they were all of a sudden trying to pawn off the blame solely on the media. Once again, playing the blame game. And while Lloyd's mother does shed some much-needed light on the issue, she's most definitely oversimplifying things, intentionally or not. Jake Lloyd's upbringing in the aftermath of The Phantom Menace wasn't as dark as we were once led to believe, but there's more than just a little to contradict this notion that he wasn't subjected to any fan backlash growing up. I mean, for starters, according to Ahmed Best, he was subjected to most of the backlash online as well, but there was plenty in real life who harassed him without remorse. And he played an animated character in the film, meaning you'd have a hard time recognizing him in the real world. But even so, some still managed to do so. So if that was the case for Ahmed Best, to say Lloyd received no backlash from crazed Phantom Menace detractors in his day-to-day life is just a little too far-fetched. And there is a fairly infamous interview with Jake Lloyd who does shed some light on what life was like for him after he fulfilled his Star Wars obligations.
Part of my life for the last 10 years. Yeah.
Is it something
High
like
school is, they wouldn't let it go, so you know how they can be in high school. They're so charming and intelligent. Awesome people. So, yeah, it was wonderful. College has been similar. Again, you'll never find more intelligent, charming people than the drunk students of the college world. I certainly shouldn't complain about it. It's just, it's a funny aspect of everyone. It seems to be a universal aspect of culture, is that once you hit that age, it's whatever stands out the most must be said the most.
Now, having seen that, while Jake Lloyd does come across as somewhat bitter towards both his school and college life, it's quite clear that, during that particular time anyway, he was more so indifferent about Star Wars, likely due to being overexposed to it, and having to deal with the occasional loser from time to time. But as I'm going to make crystal clear just a bit later, this is hardly what one could equate to him having his life ruined by Star Wars and hating the very film and experience he took part in, as the media would have you believe, because as far as I've seen, this interview is where the narrative really started to gain steam, and the media twisted the shit out of Lloyd's words so much to fall in line with their own agenda, insisting that he finds The Phantom Menace so bad that he can't even watch it.
I wouldn't, because I know that asshole's life is worse than I could make it. I don't believe in changing or regretting or wishing that the past had changed anyways. And even if I had that option, I'd still go with it. About 10 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
And do you have no...
Actually, that's not true. Sorry. I just tried to block that memory out. I watched it at a friend's house. I wasn't really paying attention. He had another friend over who was much more interesting than I could find in the movie. She was gorgeous. So, yeah, I can't remember it. It's been 10 years. I don't know, sitting in a pod racer was kind of cool. Just sat there and George would shout directions and I'd just pull on the levers. That was fun. I enjoyed it when I saw it when I was younger, and that's who it's for. It's for children, it's for young adults, it's also for the fans who can kind of let themselves enjoy it. Because when you have something like that, there's a lot of expectations for it to be for it to meet the standards of an older public, and I don't think George did that. And I've noticed there's every time I come to one of these, there's always people who bring their smaller children, their 9, 10-year-olds, who just absolutely love the film, and that's who it's for. So that's kind of where I understand my enjoyment. For me to go back and watch it now, I just think would be a little creepy.
When in actuality, all he seems to have meant is it would be weird going back and watching a movie where he was a child and was acting like a child in a movie primarily for children. Which is more than understandable, but the media even took it one step further, claiming that Jake Lloyd supposedly called out George Lucas for disappointing fans.
Let's watch my favorite part again, shall we?
I enjoyed it when I saw it when I was younger, and that's who it's for. It's for children, it's for young adults, it's also for the fans who can kind of let themselves enjoy it. Because when you have something like that, there's a lot of expectations for it to be for it to meet the standards of an older public, and I don't think George did that. And I've noticed there's every time I come to one of these, there's always people who bring their smaller children, their 9, 10-year-olds, who just absolutely love the film, and that's who it's for. So that's kind of where I understand my enjoyment. For me to go back and watch it now, I just think would be a little creepy.
Once again, the media lied. And basically all Jake Lloyd really said was that George Lucas didn't set out to appease people, and that he stayed true to what the films always were. He didn't cater to the marketplace, who expected him to make the films that were more adult for them, and they were disappointed for it, which, coincidentally enough, also falls almost perfectly in line with, you guessed it, that same interview from 1999, where George Lucas explains why he kept Anakin as a young boy, even though having him as a teenager would have been more marketable, but storytelling isn't about catering to the marketplace. And having Anakin remain a small child better served the story that he was telling. Also, just for the record, there's no fucking way in hell the Jedi would have trained Anakin Skywalker if he was a troubled teenager, especially if they barely took him on as a seemingly ordinary 9-year-old boy. But back on point, the comments that Jake Lloyd made are in no way throwing shade at Lucas. Or the prequels for that matter. It was just framed as such by scumbag Star Wars degenerates and the media. It's funny because in that same year, possibly even at that same event, Jake Lloyd was lured into yet another really crappy interview with another really crappy journalist who calls out Jake for being somewhat hostile and awkward, when in actuality all Jake Lloyd was doing was not taking any of that douchebag's bait, and given his extensive exposure to the media for over a decade up to that point, He's obviously become very wise to their act.
Now, Richie, Jake Lloyd from Phantom Menace, he hasn't done a lot of interviews over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and yours was kind of awkward.
It was very awkward. Have a look at this.
Our next guest is from a galaxy far, far away. Jake Lloyd, a.k.a.
Anakin Skywalker.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say it, I'm sorry.
Now, what have you been up to? The movie came out 99, was it?
Yeah.
So it's been 10 years.
Yeah, and I've been in school the entire time, so...
What are you studying?
Right now I'm studying film and psychology.
Okay. So is the acting career over? What's the plan with all that?
It seems to be relatively over. I quit acting about 10 years ago, so I think that's pretty well and behind me, and editing seems to be where I'm heading next.
And you would have seen a lot of the world, a lot of red carpet.
Yeah.
What was that like? What was that like back in the day?
It was cool. It was red carpet experience. I'm not a big fan of cameras anymore, but it's awesome. It was fun.
Have you still got all the paraphernalia, your little figurines? Have you kept all the merchandise?
No.
You shunned it a bit?
No. I just didn't keep the merchandise.
And what about with the ladies? Do you get recognised a lot? Has it helped being the young Anakin?
I don't think pulling the Force card would be a really good idea with the ladies.
What do you use, the editing card?
Yeah, I always use the editing card.
So at school, though, you must get recognised. Has it helped you in the editing thing? Or has it been a bit of a hindrance?
How do you mean?
Being the young Anakin.
That doesn't play into it at all.
So it doesn't, no one knows about it, or they don't care?
That's just the social environment that you're asking about.
It was obviously a big part of your life, which is why I'm asking.
Yeah?
But it seems like you're not real happy about being asked about it.
No, I'm plenty happy being asked about it. It just seems that I'm just trying to ascertain the real meaning of your questions and make sure I give you the best interview possible.
Before we let you go, child stars have had a bit of a... They get a bit of a reputation that they turn to, a life of drugs, so may the Force be with you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Wow. But above all else, there is this one egregious example, and possibly what will soon become the most infamous instance, of the media lying about Jake Lloyd to drag George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels through the mud. And it's an article from UK tabloid The Sun that came out in March of 2012. Now, based on my own research, the original article has since been lost or deleted, and I can only speculate as to why, but I'd imagine it having something to do with the fact that the article itself was completely full of shit. However, again, that didn't stop both the fans and the media from taking this ball of absolute horse crap and running with it as a smear campaign against both the Star Wars prequels and George Lucas. According to all of the secondhand media that was simply regurgitating Jake Lloyd's alleged quotes from the article, much of what that article based its information on was this interview, which we covered, that Jake Lloyd gave in 2009, where he briefly outlined some of his frustrations in the years since filming Episode 1, but of course the article again twists his words into saying he hated making the movie, George Lucas failed the fans, blah blah blah. We already covered this, and again, this is not at all what Jake Lloyd was actually saying. Even going as far as to say Jake Lloyd apparently blames George for all of the misfortunes he's had to suffer, burnt his Star Wars memorabilia, much of which he obtained while filming the movie.
Have you still got all the paraphernalia, your little figurines? Have you kept all the merchandise?
No.
You shunned it a bit?
No. I just didn't keep the merchandise.
And even quit acting because of how much some people hated The Phantom Menace, resulting in Lloyd wanting nothing ever again to do with Star Wars, even going as far as to quote him, saying that his life was a living hell after being cast in The Phantom Menace. Now take a minute, absorb that, and let's put a pin in it for just a moment, because this part's gonna knock your socks off. Now, you know about the more recent comments from Jake Lloyd's mother that renders most, if not all, of this narrative pushed by the media to be an absolutely heinous act of bullshit, with an agenda against George Lucas and the prequels, and 12 years later, now that the online conversation surrounding both the prequels and George Lucas has sharply swayed in the opposite direction, the media and Star Wars fans are now much more interested in signal boosting the Lloyd family side of the story. However, the reason this is so profoundly hypocritical is not only with this shift in the media climate, but also the new narrative by detractors of the prequels and the backlash towards certain cast members including both Jake Lloyd and Ahmed before all this internet fan and media flip-flopping, when it comes to these same individuals, their old mentality towards the Backlash used to be, it's not our fault, they deserved it, they sucked. But as of 2024, their mentality has since very disingenuously become, see, we didn't do anything, it was just the media being jerks. And in the case of the media, vice versa. And now the general consensus is to not blame the actors because it was supposedly all George Lucas's fault. When again, that's a very pathetic justification to excuse and pass off the embarrassing level of backlash that these same clowns levied towards actors that were simply portraying an optimistic and somewhat gifted 9-year-old boy and a cartoon fucking rabbit in a child demographically targeted film from a bunch of grown-ass men, be it from the media or the fans. However, to add on to this utterly vile hypocrisy of theirs, unlike the more recent comments made by Jake Lloyd's mother in 2024 that dispels most of the false notions surrounding her son's upbringing in the years since The Phantom Menace released, as I said, much of those notions come from this incredibly suspect article that released back in 2012. You want to know the one person who disagrees and outright denies that this interview with the son ever took place? As well as all of those apparent statements that were given to the tabloid damning both George Lucas and The Phantom Menace were completely and utterly false? Why none other than Jake fucking Lloyd himself, who just days later after the interview took place, on his own Facebook page, put out a statement saying the interview the son claimed he gave them never even fucking happened. And the truth shall set you free! It was a lie. It was all a lie. It was a lie from the very fucking beginning. A fiction of the media, many of which come from the same demographic of Star Wars clowns that took part or enabled the People versus George Lucas. Some of which who grew up to be journalists with a chip on their shoulder who felt the need to lie about an actor's mental health and upbringing because they simply didn't like their precious Darth Vader saying yippee as a 9-year-old boy. How fucking telling is that? This statement from Jake Lloyd that undercut this narrative that he hated Star Wars and that he hated George Lucas and that he hated The Phantom Menace, again, was released all the way back in 2012. So that begs the question, why? Why didn't anyone hear about it? Why was hardly anyone aware of it? Simple. Because both the media and the online collective of Star Wars degenerates, similarly to the details surrounding the victimization of Ahmed had no interest in the truth surrounding Jake Lloyd's upbringing and his actual thoughts on Star Wars and George Lucas until it was fucking convenient for them. And as a result, this narrative has been floating around for years and years, unchecked and unchallenged.
Unchecked, unchallenged, killing at will.
On a personal note, in 2012, I myself was still very much unengaged with the internet. I had no idea that this was even going on, or that there was this vocal group of online weirdos trying to run George Lucas and the prequels into the ground. So I came into the conversation quite late, and I had no idea that for years I'd been referencing an interview that never actually took place, due to I myself being gaslit by the media into believing a lie. And this would have remained the case if I hadn't come across a reference to Jake Lloyd's Facebook statement that completely debunked this narrative from some random internet forum back in 2012, which led me to the source, and let's just say I was more than just a teensy bit absolutely fucking furious. Because prior to that, I was one of millions, including but not limited to Mark Hamill himself, who fell for the internet's lies about Jake Lloyd by the media and the collective of online weirdos who in large part belonged to the same collective involved in the People versus George Lucas documentary.
I couldn't believe some of the things they wrote about the prequels, you know? I mean, but really beyond, I didn't like it. You ruined my childhood, and I'm still angry about the way they treated Jake Lloyd. He was only 10 years old, that boy, and he did exactly what George wanted him to do. Believe me, I understand clunky dialogue.
Also, never forget those same clowns who made the People versus George Lucas tried to deceive Mark Hamill into taking part in it so that they could, much like several of the other quoted examples I've mentioned so far in this video, They could take the man's words, twist them out of context, and use it to trash George Lucas in order to serve their pathetic fucking anti-Lucas and anti-prequel and anti-special editions fanboy fucking agenda.
I almost got hornswoggled in that documentary where they weren't calling it The People versus George Lucas at the time, but I could tell from the questions they were asking me, it was an open invitation to trash George. And I have issues with George, but I love that man.
Seriously, The People vs. George Lucas might just go down as the biggest badge of shame in the history of online fan culture. The fact that some out-of-touch weirdos still actually cite it as a credible source when trying to trash George Lucas just makes me laugh at this point.
You stupid.
But back to Jake Lloyd. Again, he made it crystal clear from all the way back in 2012 that he always loved being a part of Star Wars, that the quote-unquote living hell that the media labeled his life as for both high school and college was heavily inaccurate, and that those derogatory comments that the media quoted him saying about both Star Wars and George Lucas were completely fabricated and didn't even fucking happen. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look at many of the interviews that Jake Lloyd gave right around the same time that the media claimed he said those things, it actually paints the completely opposite picture than the one that the media tried to for so many years.
The Phantom Menace is being made in 3D. What are your feelings about to see this movie again in 3Ds with you as a child?
Well, it's been so long since I've seen the movie. I think it'd be very interesting. And I mean, like here in cassette, most of the people who come up are kids. And I imagine that the movie will be, as it's intended for younger kids, it'll be very well received by that generation. And that's what I'm looking forward to most, is seeing them light up and enjoying the pod race in 3D. I think they'll really enjoy that. So.
As the question to Daniel 2 years ago, I know that he has a specific room with many collectibles based on his character. Yeah. Do you have the same for you, or?
Yeah, I've got some collectibles. Nothing like Steve, but I think few people do. So yeah, I've got some stuff that I keep hidden and treasure. So.
You don't have any communications with George anymore? Does he hold up in the Skywalker Ranch most of the time?
No, I saw him this last summer, and that was really cool. Got to meet Jon Stewart at the same time, and I was all starstruck.
Yeah.
And it was really cool.
When you saw George this summer, were you rocking this goatee look?
No.
Because I'm thinking he might have second guessed shooting episode 2 back then. He should have waited. You got like the little almost like Anakin going to the dark side thing over here.
Yeah, it just helps. I do what I can to not get recognized on the street.
Can you think of any moments of yours that might have hit the cutting room floor that you really wished had been in there?
No, I mean, one of the things I've always enjoyed about Lucas is that he likes the beginning and the end of films. You know, with the film process, he likes writing and then he loves editing.
Doesn't like directing so much.
Well, no, I mean he does. It's just when I think of him, I think of those things as just being awesome, and his directing's fine too. He's awesome, but I don't second guess his edits ever, because it's always very intelligent.
Do you like to be part of these kind of movies?
Oh yeah, it was an absolute blast. It was fantastic.
Yeah, he's Anakin Skywalker, the little one. But now it's the little grow up. How old are you?
23.
23. Wow. Do you like to work with personalities like George Lucas, one of the most popular and successful movie makers in the world?
It was an incredible honor.
About McGregor and Liam Neeson, you have a good relation with them?
I thought they were absolutely awesome guys. So, yeah, I was very fortunate to have worked with them.
What do you like most, to be on the camera or behind?
Behind it. Much prefer being behind it.
Why is that?
You get to play with more puzzle pieces.
Because we saw you, we saw a young star, and we know that you have a future there, no, in movies like an actor, but you take another way now.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't really want to be an actor, so.
And you don't want to be anymore an actor?
No.
Why? What is that? I just have the curiosity.
Yeah, I just would. It's afforded me the opportunity to be whatever I want to be, so I'm gonna go ahead and be an editor director.
Exactly, and you can be the director in Hollywood in a few years, maybe.
Yeah.
You want to do movies, to make movies?
Yeah, I prefer music videos. They're my favorite, but I can do that.
Okay, so to summarize, the key takeaways from this are: number 1, fuck the media. Number 2, fuck the people versus George Lucas and any influencers or fans that endorsed or shared their same bullshit, deceptive slimebag mentality. And number 3, most of the detractors of Jake Lloyd's Anakin Skywalker in the aftermath of the Phantom Menace were just a bunch of online losers who were signal boosted by the shitty-ass media and who tried to gaslight the vast majority into sharing their bullshit perspective, even if it meant lying their asses off, which they did. Because they thought a 9-year-old boy ruined their childhood by saying the word yippee, and not to mention, again, an animated fish rabbit with long ears and an alien accent. Like, how fucking sad is that? Seriously. As for Jake Lloyd, whose mental troubles are certainly unfortunate, they have little to no connection to Star Wars and the petulant fan backlash his character received from a vocal minority of losers. Because most of it, again, took place online and he wasn't exposed to it the same way that Ahmed Best was. Which is fortunate, but even though still likely comes across some dickhead hater once in a while who can't let their ridiculous vendetta go. It's pretty clear by the positivity he exhibits in interviews that these people are few and far between, and certainly don't account for the majority of Star Wars fans, of both the original trilogy and the prequels, or the general audience as a whole. As Hayden Christensen so eloquently outlined in this interview when questioned about the backlash he received.
Yeah. I don't know if I have any advice for that, but just, don't take it too seriously because unfortunately those are the ones that make the most noise, but the majority of the people don't feel that way, so keep that in mind.
And it's also very clear that Jake Lloyd has nothing but great respect and admiration for George Lucas. That's very clear in several of his interviews. And again, returning to that one glorious convention panel from 2012, he was granted the holy grail of opportunities to shit on Lucas and the Phantom Menace when he was questioned about Jar Binks. And Jake Lloyd destroyed that wise ass from the crowd without missing a single beat.
The stories were meant for kids. I mean, have you met a kid who really hates Jar Binks?
Actually, my little cousin hates him a lot.
How much of your influence did you give to him while the entire time you were watching the movie? Doesn't he suck? Doesn't he suck? And your little cousin was like, yeah, no, I completely agree.
He is the chosen one. And they shall call him Jake.
You know, as if it wasn't bad enough that the older, disgruntled Star Wars fanboy degenerates and the media alike lied about George Lucas for decades to cope with their sorrow about the fact that he made new Star Wars films and not the Benjamin Button acid trip that they craved to warp them back, at least physically, to their 10-year-old selves when Star Wars felt like the second coming of Jesus, with a copy-pasted, much worse version of its former self like The Force Awakens did.
There is no Episode 7.
But these scumbags actually stooped to going out of their way in order to preemptively scapegoat two up-and-coming young actors before the prequels were even released to the public eye. One of those actors brought a lifelike performance to one of the most technically groundbreaking characters in cinema history. The other was merely a child who simply had the audacity, in their eyes anyway, to step into the shoes of the precursor to the big bad lumbering cyborg that these social rejects idolized in the most shallow sense imaginable, to the point of pathological derangement. And as a result, they tried to poison the well and condemn them before the films were ever given an honest chance. These actors and their characters had a target on their back before a single person sat in the theater to watch the movie. They were targeted not because they didn't belong in Star Wars, they were targeted because they didn't belong in Star Wars fan fiction. By which I mean the millions of completely different alternate fan fictions that would have been as equally chastised had that slop made it onto the screen for not fitting someone else's mold. And above all else, like seriously, what easier targets were there than the youngest, most inexperienced actor in the cast and the guy playing the new quote-unquote not real CGI comic side character? In a film climate where CGI was still seen as this new evil entity polluting the film industry, which, let's be honest, to some extent is still annoyingly true today.
In my day. And that's another thing. I don't want to hear no more about how it was in your day. Shut the fuck up!
As far as targets go, these clowns couldn't have taken a cheaper shot. The larger objective, however, of this media/fanboy agenda was to tear down Star Wars creator George Lucas and the prequel films that were seen as sacrilege to the childhood trilogy. An agenda which, as I mentioned earlier, began snowballing by these degenerates after the release of Return of the Jedi and was bolstered by their pedantic disapproval of the special editions. They had a chip on their shoulder, and they preemptively went after the easiest targets they could to try and tear down the Star Wars that they did not approve of, that didn't fit each and every single one of their equally worthless headcanons. And in the years since, the media took it one step further from actively stoking the fires during the prequel's time of release. They then fabricated notions mostly out of thin air about how the movies were so horrible, apparently, it ruined the lives of its cast members. Again, most particularly Jake Lloyd and Ahmed best, and then you had publications going on to say that they despised the roles that they made the mistake of taking, and that as a result, they've since denounced George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels, which was utter horseshit, before they, in the ultimate hypocrisy, inevitably flip-flopped and condemned the same behavior they had gleefully partaken in when it was George Lucas running the show, but all of a sudden couldn't stomach the fact that the Star Wars they thought they wanted with George Lucas gone had enraged exponentially more people than the relatively harmless Jar Jar Binks did.
Princess Leia gets blown the fuck up and now has the ability to float through outer fucking space to her safety. What the fuck was that shit?
And because this was the Star Wars they fought for, they refused to backpedal. And they fought tooth and nail to try and bully the same zeitgeist into digesting the Disney dog shit and like the taste of it. Needless to say, that did not work out, which predictably has led many of those same disgraceful media outlets into folding and pretending like nothing happened. I mean, hell, case in point would be this Gen X original trilogy sycophant who writes regular articles for The Guardian using his ass for a pen and his feces instead of ink. Now again, this outlet is notorious for its terrible, simpleton, and more than likely bought and paid for pop culture takes in the case of Star Wars, and especially when it comes to the prequel trilogy. Much of their content is geared towards the same collective of original trilogy sycophants that let a cartoon space rabbit live rent-free in their minds for over 20 years. Speaking of 20 years, I've used this article several times where The Guardian hired this clown to write yet another hit piece asking whether or not we should quote-unquote forgive The Phantom Menace for its 20th anniversary, filled with exactly the same cringeworthy, loose stool, old man yells at cloud criticisms that have tried and failed to sway the zeitgeist for over 2 decades. And then, wouldn't you know it, 5 years later, be it at the Guardian's whim or his own, this same journalistic degenerate wrote another article for The Phantom Menace's 25th anniversary, and it has almost exactly the same fucking title, asking the ever-present dumb question of, is this movie as quote-unquote bad as we remember?
Hey! Shut up, you worthless piece of shit!
And you guessed it, the article posts pretty much exactly the same stupid, uncompelling, vacuous, hypocritical horseshit that Star Wars fans are so tired of hearing from an out-of-touch clown who cites such crippling flaws as quote-unquote boring politics in a movie that has less than 3 minutes of it, too much CGI in a movie that has more practical effects than the entire original trilogy combined, and of course, the Holy Grail, child Anakin yelling yippee and Jar Jar Binks being Jar Jar Binks. along with the useless allegations of racism levied at every single prequel character with an accent. And of course, this basic bitch with a goldfish attention span, unless lasers are firing or explosions are going off, cites Duel of the Fates as the film's only positive, and the closing line of his article, just like his previous one, is insisting that the film was just as bad as people remember.
10 loved it, 7 liked it or thought it was okay, and 2 are no longer Star Wars fans.
Like, you can taste the bitterness that he's practically begging people to still give a damn about hating Jar Jar Binks, and the film that quote-unquote ruined his childhood.
There, let me dry those tears. Yes, your anguish sustains me.
Because if people give The Phantom Menace a record-breaking re-release, it's just gonna make him look more and more like a jackass. Spoiler, that's exactly what happened. However, the one curious thing about this new article, when compared to the one he published 5 years ago, was insisting that the only reason for this new wave of praise The Phantom Menace was receiving was due to the franchise being bogged down by, according to him, much worse garbage. Of course, he actively ignores the fact that The Phantom Menace always had a large fan base, as many others do that project this tired-ass line of reasoning as a means of coping with the growing prequel popularity. But what's most amusing is that prior to the rise of Skywalker, this clowntard was singing a very different tune, praising Disney from the media mountaintops for bringing the Star Wars magic back with The Force Awakens, and that Star Wars was thankfully outgrowing, quote, George Lucas's worldview by allowing for actual opportunities for diversity characters in roles of power into the franchise.
Stop!
This pinhead actually says Padme was a regression for political correctness from Princess Leia in a slave bikini because Leia got to hold a blaster and all Padme ever did was change her costume.
What?
The fuck?
I will not condone a course of action that will lead us to war.
I will not defer. I've come before you to resolve this attack on our sovereignty now. We don't have time for this, Captain.
What about Padme? She seems to be on top of things.
Call this a diplomatic solution?
No, I call it aggressive negotiations.
Oh, and it gets even better. See, in the same year, he published an article calling Rian Johnson the quote-unquote best hope for Star Wars.
You stupid, ignorant son of a bitch, dumb bastard!
And he couldn't stop jerking off the hype train for The Last Jedi as the bold new direction much welcomed after the horrible prequel films.
Jesus Christ, I've met some dumb bastards in my time, but you outdo them all. Get over there!
And then, of course, years later, when it was no longer profitable, or simply outright damaging, he actively flip-flops, referring to the Disney films in his Phantom Menace copy-pasted hit piece as much worse garbage.
That's incredible!
And then he publishes a second article calling the trilogy that he once couldn't shut up about some years back because it was quote-unquote saving Star Wars from George Lucas. Yeah, he refers to the Disney trilogy as quote-unquote just that forgettable.
It's gonna be some kind of a record!
Like I said, these shameless, butthurt motherfuckers will flip-flop constantly based on which direction the wind is blowing. But some of them, like this asshole, have such a chip on their shoulder, they will still move heaven and earth to cook up new journalistic horseshit, changing the narrative, moving the goalpost, however they can, because they lack the humility to backpedal on a harmless orange amphibian comic side character designed for children in a children's movie, who still lives rent-free in their petulant fucking minds. It's incredible. But as far as the prequels go and the hate towards Jar Jar Binks and young Anakin Skywalker, it was nothing but a pathetic smear campaign from the very start. Hell, before the start, as it turns out. It would then evolve and change and revise over the years, and it was all designed to paint the illusion that the prequels failed and that Star Wars was ruined. However, as clearly evident by their maintained popularity over the course of decades, as well as their incredibly lucrative re-releases, the prequels didn't fail. Jake Lloyd didn't fail, Ahmed didn't fail, and especially George Lucas didn't fail. but they were meant to fail. They needed to fail at all costs for a myriad of different reasons, each as pathetic as the last. Socially engineered by a minority of fanboys as well as their like-minded weasels in the media.
That's a separate issue.
No. I consider them linked.
But in the end, it was their pathetic smear campaign that, despite decades of bullshit, is now looked back upon as an embarrassment and a joke. Whereas Jar Jar Binks, young Anakin, their actors, the Phantom Menace, as well as the latter two prequel films, are being looked back upon as the years go by with greater admiration, not only for the films and their actors, but of course, the legendary George Lucas himself. However, that's not to say that everyone has gotten with the new program. Some are still stubbornly perpetuating the same tired, outdated, and/or debunked quote-unquote criticisms, or just straight-up slanderous lies designed to tear apart or to reallocate the legacy of George Lucas and his accomplishments to others who comparatively don't deserve a shred of it. Be it for those individuals' own personal gain or to satiate their own bitterness, those people most egregiously being several Star Wars alumni members who were left long in the past after the making of the original trilogy, who are now desperately pining for credit in their old age, scrounging for relevancy, most notably, and most despicably, might I add, would be George Lucas's ex-wife, the fictionally appointed fairy godmother of Star Wars by dusty old degenerates who had their childhood ruined by everything post-1983, none other than Marsha Lucas herself. And while nothing should shock you at this point, you won't believe just how shameless she and others are willing to stoop just in order to make themselves look good in hindsight, even though there are 3 extremely comprehensive Star Wars history books that give an honest and nuanced accounting, recognizing their contributions, but evidently they can't help themselves wanting a larger piece of the Star Wars legacy for themselves, even if it's directly at George Lucas's expense. Which, given that he gave them greater creative and lucrative career opportunities than probably anyone else in their entire careers over the course of their lives, is nothing short of heinous, especially when it comes to Marsha Lucas, when you take into account just how much money she's made off her ex-husband for contributions that are microscopic by comparison, as well as the notoriety she's gained from butthurt Star Wars degenerates and the media, hell-bent on destroying her ex-husband's legacy for her contributions to Star Wars that she didn't actually make, and this will be discussed in the next part of the series. But that brings us to the end of part 4. Initially, this was meant to be the final part of the series, but as it turned out, I was naive, and the latter portion of this series has grown substantially in length, and I felt it appropriate to keep the series sectioned into topics that don't wildly differ from one another. I hope you gained some additional insight into the history of Star Wars, or in this case, the history of the zeitgeist surrounding Star Wars, and 2 of its most infamously reviled characters and actors by this same minority collective of petulant weasels who wanted to see the prequel trilogy fail before they even came out simply because they didn't fit the mold they had envisioned in their unimaginative empty fucking heads. Granted, they tried and failed, and as we all know, both Jar Jar and Anakin in The Phantom Menace were received with glowing praise as 2 of the most wholesome aspects of the film by the majority of audience members that weren't online in reclusive internet chat rooms at the time. That said, thanks for watching part 4 and staying to the very end. I will be returning very soon with the Legacy of George Lucas part 5. Until then, take care and bye for now.